Look at us, we're learning. We're a learning organization, which brings us to why we're here today, translating learning into PME. So first of all, thank you very much to all the panelists today. And I'm going to try something here where we speed things up by skipping bios, first we'll kind of a quick intro, and then they'll go right into kind of what their comments are, and then we'll move into questions after that. So the main thing I want to keep in mind, just kind of open up with is like, I brought this up as a comment earlier, is that we do wargaming for different reasons, right? It's a tool like Microsoft Word, right? Like I could write a novel with it, or I could write a poem, or I might just do a TPS report with it, right? The purpose of wargaming is determined by the problem, right? And so we have different sets of problems that are out there. And luckily we have a whole set of professionals up here who work on different types of problems. And so we're going to do some multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary leveling of the bubble here on learning and translating it into long-term games. So with that, I'll start here on the far end and pass this microphone off. I think we got slides.
So my name is Charlotte Lathrop. I'm from the Center for Applied Strategic Learning. CASL is situated under the National Defense University, and I am on the CASL North campus, so right in Fort McNair. We also have folks down in Norfolk. That's enough, but there we go. So first, regular standard views are my own, non-CASLs, NDUs, governments, DODs. And so one of the interesting things about our folks, we are about half civilians and half military faculty. And our student body tends to be a little different than a lot of the other JPME institutions. First, it's JPME 2, and so that means most of our folks are 05 or above. We also have a strong contingent of folks from the interagency, so everywhere from state, treasury, commerce, IC, and about 150 different international fellows that are situated within the school. So from different, I think, 72 ally and partner nations. So all of the games that we do are unclassified, just because of those classroom constraints. This is really just situated like what kind of games we do. We're focused on national strategy. Looking really at the whole of government perspective. And so CASL is supporting all of the different component colleges, and also we have some direct connections with the Office of Secretary of Defense through the National Security Policy Analysis Forum, NSPAC, which is a great acronym, and some direct connections with the interagency. We have State Department detailees within our teams, and so we are able to kind of directly work with state and get that perspective when we are designing games. So some things about CASL itself is last year we executed over 80 different exercises that 58 of those were for the component colleges. And so part of the reason we do so many of the external engagements is really to find kind of what are the problems and concepts, decisions and insights that are needed in the field with those problems, because that's what our students are going to be forced to contend with once they graduate. And so having more of that experience of what is happening in the combatant commands, in multinational exercises, over at state and in the IC, we're able to bring that into our game design as well, so that the students get a fuller learning perspective. So one of the most important things I think that CASL has been able to learn, and one of the challenges we face, is getting faculty to really understand the size and scope and scale of the different kind of methodologies of wargaming. So ours range everything from an entire school, where that is 20 seminars running a game basically simultaneously, to a specific regional concentration course that may just be 6 students over the course of 2 hours. One of the major constraints that we end up finding is that within JPME, you're constrained by contact hours. And so everyone who looked at games and kind of game execution analytically, getting all the folks you need in the room is really hard. For JPME, a lot of that constraint is you only have so many hours that the faculty are allowed to, work with the students. And so the games have to facilitate that. And so one of the things we've been trying to drive is that there are different gaming methodologies that can work for their specific needs, and how games can enhance their syllabus, because they're the people who understand the curriculum, the syllabus, the PLOs that are required for JPME much better than we are going to. We are game designers as opposed to, teaching faculty curriculum developers. And so if they understand the different tools that they have available to them, they have been really willing to then work with us and build more experiential learning into their curriculum. And so I know a lot of folks are talking about the gaming literacy amongst, students that they're working with and building that. We found that some of the most important learning is actually getting faculty gaming literacy, so that they understand what they are doing, what they are bringing, and what we can bring to them. And so one example is kind of an evolving collaboration we've had with the National War College. In the academic year 23, we did a full college multi-day facilitator-driven game. They had done kind of handoff like TTXs a couple of times within their core course. This was the first time that it was kind of bringing in that facilitator, rigidly adjudicated game as well. And through that, we were able to find a lot of those, receptive faculty members, those faculty champions who then were able to work with us in the next academic year to figure out where those games fit in better within the curriculum, because they had identified a lot of gaps in student knowledge in terms of, our capabilities, adversary capabilities, and things that you really want people to understand before the last week of school in a capstone exercise. And so bringing that earlier into the semester so that it better fit in with the syllabus and what they were trying to achieve over the entire course of the year. In the next year, we did that part and then expanded the number of games we did. And then this year, it's focused on kind of developing new games and new gaming methodologies to use within these courses. And a lot of those were actually developed for separate component colleges. So our faculty have, amazing experience. Some folks, their entire career has been in the defense industrial base, or the entire career has been focused on like global force management. And once they have that gaming literacy and understanding of games, then they're willing to help within the game design process. And once you're able to get them to understand games, how we're abstracting and why, bringing in that subject matter expertise is invaluable. And as we're developing these games, being able to cross-pollinate them between the different component colleges has shown to be extremely useful in starting a global force management game for the Eisenhower School that's focused on strategic acquisition. Taking that game and using it over at the College of International Security Affairs so that they can understand global force management in a more adaptable model, and bringing that to different component colleges, modifying as needed, but having a base game that we're able to continuously iterate on and update, because we're running it for 16 seminars and we can run it every year, because you're going to have to talk about GFM every year. And so the model can get better. And that's an area in educational wargaming where I think we have an advantage over analytical, because it's usually a one and done. Versus JPME, you're going to be talking about those, issues consistently. And so if you're willing to have faculty that are going to work with you in the design of things, you can make that model better, and you can continuously learn and adapt what your organization is doing to better provide that learning. And so last slide in here, all the things with an asterisk are different games that we are running. For one of the core courses at National. And all of the ones with asterisks are also different methodologies of games. Some of them are scenario-driven TTXs, others are card-based games, others planning exercises. Some, you'll see OWS in there, and we have a lot of modifications and add-ons to build different layers of strategic thinking into that system. To modify it more for our students' needs, but really getting folks focused on different methodologies for different purposes, and bringing a team in with diverse perspectives is really useful, because a lot of our civilians come from extremely different backgrounds. Our military members also tend to be pretty different backgrounds as well, and being able to bring in all of that expertise helps us to build different kinds of games. And through this, the the attempt and hope for a kind of cohesive student learning experience, because a lot of these games end up building contingencies so that they are more invested in the game in the very end, because they have built the force, they have decided their force posture, they have kind of developed their defense industrial based priorities. And that is all impacting the final game that we are doing with them. So they get to kind of fight their strategy that they have been working on. And so if there's anything that, as a person from Castle, but also disclaimer, these are my is kind of really recognizing and getting faculty to recognize that gaming is a multi-tool, and each game can serve a different purpose. And getting them to understand that and be able to work with you is kind of the best way to develop gaming in PME.
Great. Can we, Mike, or I'm sorry, Stephen, what about from the analytical side of the house? How does it differ from the educational side of the house?
I would say from the biggest difference, kind of cut the story short here, is where you start. So you're going to start with the learning outcome from the education side of the house. Analytically, start with the primary research question. But fundamentally, I would make the argument that that Venn diagram is really over top of each other and almost a circle. And the reason is because at the end of the day, you're learning something. It's just how you structure what you learn. From an analytical perspective, we emphasize the decision space of the war game. Will focus on drawing out what those research questions, whether it's the primary research questions or it's the second, third area research question, that layer. But ultimately, the decision space is going to highlight either the behaviors, the decisions, or the activities, or the consequences of those decisions to answer the research questions. But fundamentally, I would say it's still about learning. It's the same thing. It's just maybe how you start the dialogue in scope and frame.
Any other comments you want to make to open things up, Steve?
Oh, yeah, sure. I guess that was a softball. Real quick. Sorry, I thought you would. So let's pull that aspect of it. All right, I'm Steve Salon from the Center for Army Analysis, which we got to meet once before. Real quick on my background, I spent about a third of my career. I was a retired intelligence officer, but I spent a bulk of my career as an intel planner, as a joint planner, as well as a operational red teamer, both in an operational capacity and as a faculty member at what used to be the Army's Red Team University. With that said, I have the ability to be on this panel about education, and I'm primarily the only non-education person. I'm a wargame designer for an analytical organization, and that's what we do. But as I already cut to part of my argument, is that it's basically the same. It's just a different way of scoping the problem at the beginning. But why I think I'm here is for some of the comments that I posted on the blog regarding the value added for having non-war games in professional military education. And back to my background from red teaming, both what we taught there was principally critical thinking and creative thinking. And I would argue strategic thinking as well, but there's kind of a weird triad that goes on with those three. But fundamentally, it comes back to those two things. And now, of course, I focus on the analytical games. So the two things I'm going to talk about is the benefits of using non-war games in a military PME to get at military learning outcomes. And two, kind of this nexus of analytical and educational games, which I already hit. So we can kind of skip that one for the most part. But my fundamental premise is that the war games or games themselves, whether in the classroom, on the analytical board, or even as a COA development or COA comparison analysis tool, it's ultimately about the decision lab, right? That's my premise, is that's where everyone will learn the most, is when they have to make decisions, see the consequences, and live with them. And that's what separates, we talked about the difference between an exercise and a war game. In an exercise or TTX, it's easy to say that I'm going to start flowing forces on this date. That's really simple, but there's no consequence to that. Did the adversary actually have a vote? And maybe your stuff got stuck at port. But in a TTX or a rehearsal of concept or some other type of thing where you just do thinky talkies, it shows up and everybody's happy. But in the war game, there's all kinds of fog and friction that can go into there. So that's kind of the ultimate premise, is that it's about this decision lab. So let's talk about the fundamental purpose of why I'm here. it's about using non-war games in the classroom. So I used to use them extensively for the Red Team course. The examples that I used was principally the Settlers of Catan, Pandemic, and Stackelberg game. If you're ever taking a game theory course, it's one of the ones that's like in the third or fourth week. Just talks about how how companies will compete for profit margin with a limited number of buyers for an item. So I basically drew from that. And then there's some custom other decision support games that I made that the players would have. The decision space is very simple in a football game. It's the end of the game. You're down by 2 points. Do you kick a field goal? Do you run a couple plays to try to get big points? And the weather's bad, by the way. Or do you do something else? And the students got like an hour to make that decision, but I forced them through a decision cycle where they have to draw out what their decision-making process is, what are the information requirements, those types of things. So something very simple as a football decision can really stretch a 3 or 4 hour block of instruction that the students come back and say, wow, that's pretty amazing. And all they had to do something simple, kick a field goal. All right, so that's kind of the examples that I would use. And it's simpler. So the commercial game that's not a non-war game is simple. If you ever played Catan, you can learn the rules in about 5 minutes. You might screw up your first game, but after that, you got it. It may not go the way you want, but you got it. So that's a great way. The other part of commercial games, or non-war games, I should say, in the classroom for military education is there's no threat to reputational risk. Right? So there is no performance anxiety, or there's limited performance. All it is smack talking at the end, right? Or who won the bottle of bourbon at the end. But that's it. So, but if you in a military war game, in a military environment, and your future S3s and commanders really goon up at the war game table, they have concerns about this. I think anecdotally, Mike would see this as well at the CGSC, is that the combat arms officers tend to steer away from any of the war games. So that's why I purposely picked commercial games. All right, so what were the objectives that I was trying to get? Again, remember I was talking about creative thinking and critical thinking. And that's really what I was focused on. So if you boil that down to kind of learning outcomes, and emphasize decision-making and all the things that go along with that. For instance, cognitive biases, heuristics, perceptions, how they build assumptions, how did they test their assumptions? So you can actually go back into the ops cycle, the plan, prepare, execute, and assess. The one that everybody has a hard time doing is the assess. Forces them back into that loop cycle because, as again, a war game is decisions, adjudication or resolution, and consequences, and then it loops back up. So they have to deal with their consequences and their decisions, whether good or bad. So that's kind of where we're looking at on what kind of objectives we got. All right, so the keys to success out of any part of the decision lab really is this idea of reflection. So ideally, you send the students home with a structured worksheet with 4 or 5 questions, and they get a chance to do something as a facilitation tool I learned a long time ago, think, write, share. Allow the individual to think about their answers. They write them down, they pre-commit them, and they come back to the classroom the next day and spend about an hour in a wraparound, and they talk about what they learned and things like that. And then, of course, the experience, back to the PERLA, it's about experiential. That's what a war game is. That's what a war game brings to everybody, is that experiential event that's shared. And I call it group therapy. So once they had a chance to think, write, share individually, we kind of share as a whole, and then they start to learn from each other, which is kind of the core of kind of adult education. Start to learn from each other. All right. So that's kind of why I think I'm here, is the success of bringing, and the idea of bringing non-war games back into the classroom, even for military PME, because you can easily get an op design in Catan. Anything that has any type of strategic component to it, Catan, you can get there. Operational design, it's about sequencing, right? Arrangement of forces. If you go down the elements of op design, you can get that in just about any commercial strategy game. And with that being said, I think that sums it up. I do have one final thought. For all those, this is off topic, so I'm off script, is that if you have a wicked problem or a complex problem, and I tried to do this, we got kicked out of the red team before. I never had a chance to implement this. It was to, if you had a complex problem, a wicked problem, build a war game. Nothing gets understanding of a problem like making people break it down in components that you can actually digest, put on a table discreetly, where all your assumptions become explicit. And I think that's the core of any war game.
Oh, sorry, I'm 100% out of turn. And I'll wait a second.
So that's it. I guess I'll take questions. After we're done. That's his.
Can you hold it? Do you want to do it? Go for it.
No, I'll hold it. I'll hold it.
Okay.
I've got my legs crossed.
Oh, there we are. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Mike Dunn. I am a battle simulation specialist at Matt General Staff College, and I'm a war gamer. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
I've war gamed in 16 hours, so I'm turning to Jones. Essentially, I'm going to walk you through the method that we use whenever one of our instructors comes to us and say, hey, I want to put on a game. And typically, my first question before I get into our method is, well, why a game as opposed to any other instructional technique, such as share and share or case study or lecture. And that helps me understand where they're coming from. And the other part of that is if they tell me that the game they want to run is diplomacy, my following question is, why do you hate your students? Yes, pretty much. A little bit about me before I get into our method. I started off my Army career as a tanker, armor officer. And after I overcame that intellectual disability, I became a post-area 57 simulation operations officer. And so this is basically my dream job as a simulation operation officer, is to essentially pass that skill set on to closing the Army at one major at a time. And shout out to folks that were my former students here. Great to see you all. And I will read openly, if you do not understand the PDI model by now, this is the one thing you want you to come away with from graduation was our method. So, what is PDI?
Purpose.
There we go. First part of it is purpose. Why do you want to run a game? And this is where we are actually linking education speak into simulations. What is our primary learning objective? What are our terminal learning outcomes? And what are enabling learning outcomes? What is it you're trying to achieve? And up there you see the nesting diagram. The TLLs essentially is what is the purpose of the overall course. In our case, Matt General Staff College. And then we go to the terminal learning outcome, which is what is the purpose of a specific block of instruction or course. And then we get into the enabling learning outcomes, which are the actual individual class sessions themselves. Okay, got it. Now we understand our scale and what it is you're trying to achieve. And then we go into what's our aim point. And we're using Bloom's taxonomy of learning, where you have something at the simplest level of, well, familiarity, where you are able to look at the concept. In this case, knowledge that, yeah, I remember seeing that on a PowerPoint someplace, to the highest level of learning, which is the evaluation, where we will want you to be able to take these concepts and rearrange them into wholly new, novel ways where you can actually employ them. Then we go into the decisions. What are the dilemmas that we want our students to wrestle with in order to get to those learning outcomes? Essentially, I've got a very quick matrix of the four different ways of decisions that you were trying to work through. The first one is you would think intuitively it'd be obvious that good decisions versus bad decisions. Well, nobody wants to make a bad decision. Well, that's actually kind of useful. It's a great way to get into the deep dive into what makes a good decision and what makes a bad decision. And how do I know I'm making a bad decision? So there is usefulness in that. Then there is the great dilemma of a good decision versus another good decision. Well, geez, if they're both good decisions, then how do I evaluate which one is the best? How do I optimize this problem?
And this is really great for being able to look at a course of action and that passes the feasible, acceptable, suitable, complete, and distinct, and essentially come up with your evaluation criteria. Well, why is this the better good decision over another good decision? Then there's the Kobayashi Maru of decisions. A bad decision versus another bad decision. Well, gee, that's kind of rough. Well, the goodness of that is it teaches you on how to basically mitigate risk. What it is that you are trying to choose the least bad option and why the least bad option. And this is where it gets to end state, is what it is I want to be able to walk away with at the end of the day, the outcome of my decision. And then there are times when there are no decisions to be made. And typically what we tell our instructors is, well, if there's no decisions, you don't really get a game. However, it is okay to walk through the simulation. Simulation, by definition, by AMSO, is a model iterated over time. And that simulation, when you add in human decisions in the loop, then it becomes a game. Sometimes it's useful to run through the simulation just so you can understand the process. So you develop that understanding in the mission command sense of understand, visualize, describe, direct, lead, and assess as to how things work. So once we understand what you're trying to achieve, and then once you understand what the dilemmas that we're putting in front of our students, then we get into the actual discussion of the game itself, or the interactions. Okay, so the first things that games must do for the interactions. First thing it has to do is give you information about the game state, about the decisions that you're being asked to make. And as you can see here, I have the word reasonable, and this is where it gets into the war. You don't necessarily have to give 100% complete, accurate information, but you do need to provide enough information for your game players, your participants, to make decisions that are relevant to the experience. The next thing that a game must do is it must be able to translate those decisions into actions. And in the world of computer gaming, this is the user interface. And the ease of that user interface really goes a long way into getting that to why you're using the game. One of the failure modes, by the way, of quote-unquote professional military-made war games is that the user interfaces are terrible, made by engineers or other engineers. And they are terrible for non-engineers to try to contend with. Tabletop games, by their nature, are fairly simple to work with. You've got the game, you got the pieces, you've got your resolution mechanisms are right there. The next thing that needs to happen is the actual thing that's happening behind the curtain, and that is the model itself. How are we taking these actions and how are we processing these actions using the game mechanics to get to a result? Computer game, this is all the black box stuff that's happening behind the curtain. A tabletop game, which is why I like using them if I'm trying to develop understanding, is the players have to work the model themselves. And then finally, the game has got to be able to provide information about the outcome. It's got to be able to present the new game state, and it's got to be able to link how your decision translated into an action got you this result. Which gets us to the end of the day is you need to understand it. You need to really be able to understand how you got the consequences of your actions that stem from your decision making. If you don't have that, you're really passing up the opportunity to make the most of your experience. This eye chart here is is essentially just a case study of the game I'm running tonight for game night, which is Major's Gambit, which was a partnership with Georgetown University Wargaming Society, Sebastian's students from last year, which gave us an amazing game that has really grown length with us. What you see on the far right is the purpose. And these are from the advanced sheet from the BOP out there, is what it is we're trying to achieve. what's our learning objective, what are our early learning outcome, and what's our enabling learning outcome. And at the bottom is the cognitive aim point we're trying to go for. And as you can see, we aim for the highest level of cognitive learning, which is evaluation. From that, we're able to translate these outcomes that are desired into decision through the game. And this is from the one-page design document, which is actually 3 pages, but we won't go into that, that highlights what it is we want our students to contend with. And as you can see are some of the themes that the blog author and the instructor, Dr. Crump-Lithgow, had identified. And from there, we're able to take these decisions, which became our design imperative, and translate it into a game. And when we have a tabletop game, or any game for that matter, is that we deconstruct that into 4 different components. The first component is time. Well, in our case, the time horizon for to get to the learning outcome was game turns of 4 hours each, which would replicate a day or 2 in the life of a division. The next thing that we talked about is scale. We were looking at division level operations, so we basically scaled our atomic level of units at the battalion level. And then we looked at the map scale, as you have your battle operational environment, is basically a non-typical or non-specific piece of ground, which is very generic, with a ground scale of 4 kilometers per hexagon, which is about right for division operations. And then finally, a resolution mechanism as expressed into our sequence of play. And if this is a tantalizing description, please stick around for game night, and I'll be more than happy to run you through a few turns of the game. Okay, I will pass this on.
Thank you. Putting myself on the clock here. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Barrett. I'm the Wargaming Director at Marine Corps University. By way of introduction and context to my comments, so you can put in the right lens, before I retired from the Marine Corps, I was the Wargaming Director for the Marine Corps Wargaming Lab, or Warfighting Lab, rather, and that in that role was doing analytic wargaming, looking at force design, looking at the future. That was kind of the focus and purpose of that wargame effort. For the last 3 years now, since I retired, I've been on the education side of the house for wargaming. And then prior to that, I was a part of the Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group, which does battle staff training out in California, primarily at the battalion and regimental level. And so my background on this is looking at it through the lens of training, also from a force design, force development standpoint, as well as education. But my current position is focused on education. Obviously, this panel is looking at education. First off, thanks for the invite, for inviting a Marine Corps representative on the panel. I really appreciate that. I do want to note also that I'm a graduate of the Naval Academy, and my brother is a graduate of West Point. And for those of you not paying attention to the college sports world, this is a historic year for Navy and Army wargaming with really unprecedented performances and records by both the Army and the Navy college football teams, which might even lead to a very interesting development of them playing twice this year in playoffs. So if you're not paying attention to Army Navy game developments, you might want to, because this is a historic year in their football successes so far. I also have some Marine Corps University faculty in the room. Could you guys raise your hands from Marine Corps University? So we got Lieutenant Colonel Bessie, Army, from our Command Staff College, and retired Lieutenant Colonel Chris Nelson from our distance education program. And so I do have 2 wargaming advocates, proponents from the faculty side of the house. So when I start talking about faculty and some of the challenges with faculty, it's not them. It's others that I need to focus on and work on. These guys are definitely enablers to the cause. But if you have questions, they're the practitioners on the faculty side, and please engage them. All right, I'm going to try to be relatively concise, and if there's something that I say that prompts a question, please ask, and I can go into further detail. But I have really 3 design questions that I want to cover, and my colleagues here on the panel have, I think, covered these already, so I'm going to be very short on these. And then 3 design challenges with respect to educational wargaming. So design question number 1 is wargaming to learn what? And in my role, I'm supporting 6 different schools that range from the tactical level, where most of the games are at the battalion level, the captain's course, Marine Expeditionary Units. That's the focus of their games. Those are very tactical in nature. And then we've got Command Staff College, School of Advanced Warfighting, and we've got the Marine Corps War College, which now gets up to the theater and global, national security strategy level. So the span of our games is pretty wide ranging. So when I get faculty, asking for a war game, I really am like, well, okay, well, what do you want the students to learn? One of the most common answers to that question is we're doing planning, right? Because we're a joint PME school and we're focused on planning, and we want a war game so that we can test their plans. And that's great. That's laudable. I think one of the things I think is a deficiency about our learning objectives in the schools is it doesn't focus enough on the individual cognitive competencies for warfighting, right? We have a collective team that produces a plan, and then the ask from the school is we want to test the plan. It's not about the mental models of our students. We want to cultivate the right mental models in our students so they can make informed decisions based on a right set of mental models. That's not the answer I get usually. Now there's exceptions to that, but usually the learning objective in our educating our PMA, it's really about, hey, we want to test the plan. And there's not a sophisticated enough insight into what do we really want the students to learn, right? What do we want them to walk away with out of this war game? And I would just submit that those individual cognitive competencies, those mental models, is really what we should be aiming at more often as a learning objective. I'll give you an example. You can have a chess grandmaster that has fantastic cognitive competencies and mental models, but those mental models might be completely irrelevant to a great power born in the Pacific, right? Because they haven't trained themselves and cultivated their set of mental models to make those decisions. How many of our students know what the different types of destroyers are in both the U.S. fleet and our allied fleets, in the Chinese fleet, or the rocket forces and the capabilities of those weapon systems? And if you don't have a mental model in your mind of what that system can do, then how can you make risk calculus decisions if you don't understand what it can do? And that's what I mean by having the right set of mental models in your mind, that when you're a future staff planner or a future commander, that you are able to reference and okay, well, I know they have these set of capabilities. So what that means is, while historical wargaming, I'm a huge believer in historical wargaming, and I love its inclusion in the courses, and I absolutely believe that we need to have it, because you can teach fundamentals, main effort, objective. You can teach, principles of warfare through historical games, and that gives you a case study context that you can look at. But that can't be the only set of scenarios that we wargame. If we want to cultivate mental models for great power competition and conflict today, then we also have to wargame within those scenarios of today. And our schools are doing that, and we're doing it on, I would say, even increased tempo. But I just want to really emphasize that from a learning standpoint, educating and educational wargaming, really doing it deliberately and intentionally by design. And what are those mental models we're trying to cultivate? All right, question number 2 is, what is the player experience that you're going for? One of the key questions, do you want the students to play blue or red or both? And I would just submit that it's important, to play red. However, the schools, the counter argument, and a lot of the faculty have a very legitimate argument against playing red, and that they don't want the students playing against a red that is mimicking U.S. force capability back to them. They would rather have their students play blue against a professional red that is modeling the red force capabilities in more realistic fashion. And that's a very good argument. Is one way right over the other? It goes back to what do you want them to learn? And at some point, I do believe that it's important to have students playing red and get that immersion, because that's really the only way they're going to learn and understand threat capabilities. The other is from the player experience. Do you need a war game where you just need some adjudication to happen and you want to tell a story back to the players to then inform another iteration of the planning process? Because your focus is the planning process, right? But then you want a war game to move it along because you want it to play out over time and have consequences. But all you need to do is tell a story back to the players on what happened with their first set of orders. Is that what you're looking for? And does that serve your purpose? Or do you actually want the players to play the game? Right? They're making gameplay decisions. And again, there's pros and cons to both approaches. You go back to what do you want the players to learn? And I'm a big advocate for playing the game because it goes back to my point about mental models. If you're just being told a story about what happened, what mental model are you developing? Right? Do you understand the factors that went into the outcome? Right? And if you didn't participate in the gameplay and understand what went into the adjudication, you may not understand why you didn't achieve, your objective. And it may be that you did everything right, but the dice were against you and you got a negative outcome. And if you just get told the story back that said, here's what happened, but you didn't get told that, you know what, that was like a 1% chance that was the outcome, but you rolled the 1%. So you might want to try again. But if that kind of context matters, and so what is that player experience that you're going for? Do you want them? Do you need to tell the story back to them, or do you need them to actually play the game? Question number 3: how credible does that story need to be, or how detailed? Right? We get back to the abstract concepts. Can you just do an abstract war game to achieve your goal, or do you need to get into some details on the forces and capabilities? Just take, a naval conflict in the Western Pacific. Do you just need to adjudicate battle groups, and you don't need to get into the details of each ship and its magazine and weapon systems? Or does your educational goal require that you actually get into the details of, no, you need to understand what these different missiles are and what's happening? So it goes back to what's the purpose of the game, and how credible does the story need to be? All right, that's the design questions. Now the challenges. All right, the comment was made about faculty. So I'm a big believer that wargaming in PME needs to be by, with, and through the faculty that are running the course. Number one, from a capacity standpoint, right now the Marine Corps University Wargaming Directorate currently is 2 people. And there's no way I can support all the wargaming requirements right now across all the schools. It has to be by, with, and through the faculty. Also, the faculty have the relationship with the students. It gives them credibility and that relationship. And the faculty understand exactly what they want to get. Well, usually they understand what they want to get out of this event. And they have the context with the students of having been with them in the course. If I'm parachuting in to run a war game, I'm coming in out of context of the learning experience that the students have had. So I'm a huge believer, and it's got to be by, with, and through the faculty. And I'll be honest, one of the biggest successes I've seen in this is Air War College, where their senior leadership said, we are going to war game, and every single faculty member here is going to learn the game, and we're going to have you facilitate the game, military faculty and civilian faculty. And their goal was that they would have 5 repetitions in playing or facilitating that game before they got in front of the students. And I went and observed their event and running it, and it was fantastic. I love seeing those civilian PhDs like getting into joint war fighting and facilitating with their students, and they did a fantastic job. It can be done, and too many people are intimidated by games and gameplay. And sometimes the leadership just has to like put that stake in the ground and say, no, we're going to do this, and you all are going to participate. Okay, that's by, with, and through the faculty. One other point about the faculty, though, before I leave that. The faculty in today's joint PME, joint warfighting concepts, the faculty need to be practitioners of joint warfighting. And unfortunately, our faculty are lacking in both wargaming competencies and competence. Not that they can't do it. It's just the investment of time to get them to a level of competence. But then it also, just because of the challenges and the complexity of today's battle space, they're not masters of all domain warfare. But ideally, they need to be. And so how do we get there, right? This is one of our challenges, getting the faculty raising the bar on all domain warfare, raising the bar on wargaming competencies and competence. Another challenge is the correlation of planning detail, how much they plan, with the detail in the game. And I've seen this be mismatched both directions. I'm guilty. If the students are planning for 2 weeks and they're building an eye-wateringly detailed plan, and we roll in with a very abstract game to working that plan, the students get frustrated, right? Case in point, I had a captain's course planning problem where they wanted to war game and they had 113 named areas of interest, right? Well, first off, I would submit they shouldn't have 113 named areas of interest, right? But the game we were using, it was Command Professional Edition. It's like, hey, we're going to put a box over the screen, we're going to put it some reconnaissance, and they didn't need 113. They needed like maybe 6, right? And so the students got frustrated because they have these spreadsheets and all these charts and details, and the game is not giving them a level of detail back, right? And or that they're able to apply their plan to the level of detail that they planned it, right? So there's frustration. Then it goes the other way, where we have a very detailed game, but they're only planning at a high abstract level, but we need inputs from them. And if the students aren't going to do it, then that requires the response cells to generate information at a higher level of detail. So I've experienced multiple cases where we've had a mismatch between the degree of planning that the students are doing and the model that we're using for the board game. And honestly, we haven't got it right yet in some cases. There are some cases where we do have it right, but across all the schools, there's an experimentation with various games to try to get this dialed in to the right correlation. All right, last point, and this is a quick one. The challenge of time. The time in the curriculum competing with other objectives, with other learning modalities that are important. I'll give you a quick anecdote on this one. I was asked to, I had interested congressional staffers that wanted to come down to Quantico, and they wanted to play a game. They wanted to like be in the game. And they wanted to war game, U.S. national strategy in the Pacific and better understanding the problem. And I'm like thinking, great, all about it. And I'm thinking in my mind, well, what I'd really love is to have 2 or 3 days. They're not going to have the time. Maybe they'll come down for a day and we'll just make it work. And so I said, well, how much time can they devote to it? 45 minutes. And I was just like, don't bother, right? When I sit down and play Candyland with my granddaughter, it's 20 minutes, right? That's Candyland. How do you expect to deal with the complexities of the Pacific in 45 minutes to any level of detail that matters that they wouldn't already know when they walk in the room, right? So to a degree, you have to decide, do you want the fast food war game where you're still in the drive-thru? Do you want the sit-down meal? Or are you at like a multi-day feast, right? Where you really want to dive in and wrestle with the problem and really figure it out. So that's the challenge back in the faculty is, hey, all about your wargaming. How much time are you going to commit? If it's 45 minutes, what do you really want to get out?
So we got about 10 minutes. How many questions do we have? Show again. Okay, I'm going to ask a quick one first. We did a great job of like setting up how to build these events in a way that is very
useful and structured and meets the objectives. Just cover a lot of good ground there. I want to go into, we've had an aha moment in the game. Now, how do we get that aha moment past a single person or the group that's doing the game and into the curriculum or into doctrinal change? You know, are there collection plans that you do? Are there curriculum meetups afterwards? Like, what are the methodologies that you use to take that back from an acute incident to like a large scale change in either curriculum, doctrine, or expanding the lessons learned? I'll just pass the mic down.
Yeah, every course that we run has a post-instruction conference with the instructors and the department that those instructors come from. And if we've used a game of some sort, that'll be part of that discussion. What worked, what didn't, and what needs to be changed about it. We're going to keep it ongoing.
That's the bread and butter of the analytical game, is the collection plan and the report and the data collectors and how you're cleaning the data. Whether the participants know that's what's happening, but from an educational perspective,
I think at Castle, we tend to have less of that collection plan, but a lot of that is then interacting with the faculty afterward and seeing kind of what were things that they noticed, where were the points of friction or the points that, you know, brought about the really good conversations. Because a lot of what we're trying to do in our games is bring about those important conversations between students, because all of them tend to have a lot of experience already. And kind of how do we then bring that more into the model? How do we have better after action questions so that you can bring up these conversations? So it's a more informal process than it seems like over at CFP, but more of that kind of faculty driven feedback.
I remember it's all about the reflection. So at the point, either the point of event or at the post game wrap up, forcing the students to do some cognition or metacognition of what they're thinking, what their mental models were, forcing that dialogue out for the group, I think is at least how I think we did it in the Red Team University to share those lessons learned.
The gentleman back here, as soon as Tim's done speaking, we'll go to you after Tim, and then we'll be waiting patiently. Go ahead.
I would just say also that the student developed and presented after actions are very good, right? Nothing really tells you what they learned in the game, like the students themselves reading back to you what they're walking away with.
And do you depend on the instructors then to go back and then feed that into the curriculum to change something if necessary?
Yeah, I mean, that is the school's responsibility with the faculty, and you know, my goal is to help the faculty achieve what they want to arrive at. So from a faculty standpoint, they got to look at what the students are reading back to them and decide if they want to do something different than that.
So go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Ken Fulmer. I'm right now from DITRA. So one of those joint people floating around in the Army conference. Very happy to be here. So mine actually comes from the educational wargaming sort of pre-tank effect that you get. So what sort of almost moral hazard would you have as you're going through and collecting, you know, your observations? How are you building that in that you guys have experienced as you know, decision makers come with wicked problems in particular and say, hey, get after this. And by the way, we're going to pick it right up. And now that's the design document. We're going to pass this to the headquarters.
Yeah, generally we don't do that. I mean,
Yeah.
it's dangerous ground because you want the students to feel free to fail and experiment with radical ideas, right? So some of what they come up with may be in a context or played out in a way that you can't bank on it. And this goes back to when I talked about reading the story back to the players and how much fidelity, you know, we will often, when the goal is we want them to just get to the next jumping point, we may just make a very quick adjudication that may have no grounds in reality, right? And it's just, hey, we're just making a snap judgment. We're going to read this story back, and I don't have to worry about it being credible with respect to the higher planning and feeding a concept or the force design for the future of the Marine Corps. If I'm running an analytic game, then I need that to be as credible as possible. But if I'm trying to teach principles of warfare and like, hey, you going, what's your objective? You going left or right? Then I don't necessarily need to get to that exact level of rigor that I would in an analytic case.
Yeah, for us, and Jeff Hodges had talked about this very briefly, is the reputational risk. Very few of our armored infantry officers want to play a game where they're going to get crushed by a medical service officer or a nurse or a lawyer or, God forbid, a chaplain. So one of the techniques that we use is that we never play the game to completion. Two reasons for that. First reason is if you just played a game and you got crushed, well, clearly the game itself totally is awful and they disengage in the discussion. Whereas if they win the game, it's like, hey, I'm awesome. I'm ruled. I am Rommel and Patton incarnate. And they check out the discussion. So we will always index when the outcome of the game is still in doubt. And the best reaction that we get is, no, one more turn. I almost got this. And when I'll put them on a 10-minute break before we come back for discussion, it's not uncommon that the students will still be in the room when they can be going out and taking care of logical functions and getting more coffee. They'll be at the table over the map talking about the game still. And we have to stop that discussion to start the formal class part.
All right, specifically, I'm starting an insurgency for another category of professional wargaming. It's called the exploratory game. So you leaders don't like to spend money and resources on exploring ideas. However, I would argue most of what we do in the Unified Pacific series over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been exploring ideas, and the ideas that come back aren't exactly what the building or OSD wants to hear, but nonetheless, it's helping inform and shape things. So that's it, exploratory. You heard it here first.
I mean, I just honestly would just reiterate what Tim said, that we also don't really collect on what the students are doing. We try and make it very much a free to fail environment, and that's also part of why we don't tend to take like a bunch of the student outcomes for games, because folks will always be like, oh, but what are, the learning that you've been able to generate from the students? And it's like, they did this once and they are not sneeze in this. What they did in the game is not important. The conversations they had during the game are what was important. And so we don't like collect what they do to try and inform future decisions, because that's not the kind of games that we're running.
I've got a follow on to that. I think the Halsey Alpha group at the Naval War Cup is a superb example of how this can be done well. And I would submit that what is key to that success is the continuity of the faculty over time, right? That for those of you not familiar with the Halsey Alpha approach, they will take students every year. They'll basically sequester them for a semester, or and then even in cases do it the year. And they're wargaming. They're taking a subject and they're deep diving and wargaming on that. And they're doing it over and over through that year. And then the next year, they will pick it up and the faculty will continue to do it as a long-term research. So what happens over 10, 15 years is you now have a set of faculty that have wargamed this over and over, or literally or over a decade, or in some cases 2 decades. And they bring a superb set of knowledge to the topic. And the Navy does use that skill set with Halsey and take those insights. And I've seen them have an impact. They come down and they present our general officers in our general officer course. And, hey, here's the insights that we've drawn over the last 20 years of wargaming this problem. And it's fantastic. So I think it can be done. It can be done well, but it just has to be in the right context. And I would submit there's power in the faculty that are doing that from year to year.
Yeah, one other question. I have time right here. 3 rows back.
So,
Test.
so one thing you pointed out is how obviously some things need to be abstracted out, or to get the learning objectives across, you'll have to do something that may be unrealistic. You're using the same medium, the war game, to teach real world lessons as you are, doing abstract or falsified, artificial things. How are you distinguishing to the students what events within the game are things they should learn on and what things are for the sake of the game? If that makes sense.
Okay. So as these scenarios, try to be very explicit of when we are doing that. Of if we're moving something along to go faster to get to the actual learning objectives of the game, and just being very explicit and open with the students that like, hey, we're going to move this forward to X point, or this is going to happen, so we can look at that. Because they'll understand that you're limited in time, you're limited in the scope of what the game can do. Like, I have a lot of trust that these are adults that we are dealing with, and despite the fact that maybe it means that something doesn't happen in the game that they wanted, again, these are professionals that we are dealing with, hopefully. They can understand that you are moving forward. This is, more of a fiction. This is more of an abstraction, and just being very, very open when that happens.
Ditto.
It's been pointed out already that all models are wrong. Some models are useful, and a great discussion to have with our students is to explain which models are wrong, and then that goes into a deeper dive into how is it wrong. And what should that model look like if we're going for a higher level of fidelity for our model? And that's a great way to pick out, here's what's important, here's what's not important. However, our instructors say, no, everything's important. This will be on the test.
And I would say this is why I'm an advocate for students playing the game, right? Because when they're playing the game and they're participating and seeing the adjudication, they can see where it's game, right? And then this goes back to the art of storytelling, where, like, if you're doing a strike salvo and it's 6 10-sided dice, and we're rolling the dice, and okay, here's what happened, is explaining, okay, this was actually representing a salvo of 56, tomahawks going in on the target. Here's the outcome. That is the story that we're telling. And here's the probability. And quite often, when we're doing an adjudication of a game, you'll have the expert in that domain challenge the model, right? And I actually love it when that happens, because those are the most educational moments in the whole war game, because now you get the person that is the expert in that domain telling you what's wrong with the model, right? Well, you're not factoring X, Y, and Z. And then we can say, you know what, you're absolutely right. So instead of using the game probability, what probability of success do you think this has, or failure? And then we just shift to that as the adjudication and roll the dice. But the opportunity to discuss those factors that were not being represented, at least that expert felt was not being represented, is a golden opportunity for instruction. And that's when situations like that highlight what's wrong with the model. And they learn, okay, here's what else they need to be thinking.
So I just wanted to take a minute to try to synthesize a lot of what we've heard here, plus what Jeff brought up earlier and some other questions I had heard. This was a product that I worked with some of my teammates. Tom Flounders was one of them for sure. And we went through all the literature that we could find in the wargaming simulations community to try to figure out this question of, like, what is a war game? What is an experiment? And the thing is, it's not a one or another type proposition, right? So we started with this idea that there's broadly experiments, war games, and exercises. War games being the key factor. You need human decision making as part of the point of it, right? And so when you have that, wargaming broadly breaks down the 3 different frames: research, education, and training, right? And so we've talked about all of those things today, for the most part, focusing really on education and training. On the training side, someone asked the question, what's the difference between exercises and a war game? Well, sometimes they're the same. It's a type of war game, right? It's a live war game. But if you're not actually, like I think Stephen was talking about, if you're not injecting, change or the human dimension, or maybe it was Mike, it's really more of a demonstration, which makes it a type of simulation, but not necessarily a war game, right? So, but in an exercise, you're going from a known point, and you're either demonstrating that known point, or you're trying to inculcate that into it, where you want to see how the human decision-making factor falls through. So the exercise circles here, the war game circles here, the experiments circle here. And so where wargaming and experiments overlap, that's the research experiments. And so you have hypothesis testing, exploration, as Stephen said, and demonstration, right? These may be simulations that aren't war games because they don't require a human decision to be made, or they may require a human decision made. In that case, they're a research experiment. And so you get these kind of broad categories. Now, this was geared specifically for the director of concepts, which we were trying to figure out why it is we did wargaming and simulations and explain it as opposed to why other people do wargaming simulations. But we basically boiled down to you have exercise war games, which is what you do like an NTC or Red Flag or something like that. Experimental war games where you're trying to explore how human decision-making intersects with the hypothesis of a concept or a capability of some sort. And that's where Unified Challenge, USF Force Future Games, GameX and Seminars, right? So then you have these methods that kind of span the gamut. GameX being the catch-all kind of simulation version of a war game, right? And then the non-war game experiments. We're studying a hypothesis or an idea, but we don't necessarily need the human decision maker at this time. We can just do a pure analysis of force ratio comparison and a lot of the things that CAA is really good at on top of the other things they're good at, right? So, but this is just our attempt here, and I'm sure this is open for debate, but we did try to synthesize that literature. So if you hopefully I copy that digitally somewhere. I literally rolled that out on the floor and had somebody send it to me while we're sitting here. But there's a lot of literature that's already explored all this, but it's not all in one place. And I think that's kind of what Jeff was getting at too. Is like we don't have an agreed structure because we're doing things cross-disciplinary. And so there isn't just one place. There's not just wording or just the simulations or an exercise. But it's really, I want to say it's a problem, but it's a challenge with senior leaders because this terminology is not clear. And so we get kind of fratricide across our domains on what the purpose of what we're doing things are for. And so I think it's important as professionals, we establish that up front, get the concurrence of the senior leader of, yep, we're all on the same page, and then be disciplined in our execution as we follow out so that we can grab these lessons learned and incorporate them into whether it's PME, doctrine, or future capabilities. So I hope that's helpful. I know I found everything that our panel gave us was super helpful, and so I appreciate everybody's time, and we'll take it there as the end. And if you have any other questions, feel free to stop by and ask offline.